It's a profoundly weird experience when you realize the instruction manual you were handed for life, well, it might actually have a few missing pages.
Or pages from a completely different manual.
Right, exactly. I mean, imagine you're given this incredibly thick, heavily highlighted rule book right at birth. Your parents followed it, your grandparents followed it, and you build your entire life exactly to its specifications. You follow the blueprints perfectly.
You don't even question it.
You really don't. But then, one day, you notice a door in your perfectly constructed house that opens directly into a solid brick wall, and suddenly you are forced to ask yourself a terrifying question. Like, is my house wrong? Or was the blueprint flawed from the very start?
Yeah. And questioning that blueprint, it doesn't just mean fixing a single door. It requires a complete audit of the architect, the builders, and the very foundation you're standing on. It triggers this ultimate psychological earthquake because your brain has to basically choose between the safety of the familiar and the friction of reality.
And that psychological earthquake is exactly what we are exploring in your deep dive today. We've got a fascinating stack of sources in front of us, anchored by this really in-depth interview on the YouTube channel, Steve Reed, Partner with God for Peace and Prosperity.
Yeah, it's a great conversation.
It really is. Steve sits down with a guest named Trevor Meier, who recently completely dismantled and rebuilt his entire worldview. And our mission today is to explore the anatomy of a profound paradigm shift. We're going to use Trevor's journey from a deeply entrenched traditional religious background to a completely untethered theological framework as a case study in how a person unlearns.
Right. And to frame this up carefully before we dive into the deep end, our analysis today is entirely about the mechanics of human psychology. We are examining that universal experience of questioning the systems that raised us. We aren't taking sides or endorsing Trevor's original theology or his new theology, or really any of the viewpoints expressed in the interview.
No, definitely not.
The goal here is just to understand the psychological architecture of a belief system and, what happens when it begins to collapse under the weight of its own inconsistencies.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because whether you are navigating a religious community or dissecting a corporate culture or even evaluating a deeply held political ideology, the process of unlearning is completely universal. To understand how a belief system changes, we have to start by examining the architecture of the foundation that was originally laid.
Yeah, you really have to understand the specific gravity of the environment a person is operating in. In Trevor's case, the source material reveals a system characterized by an immense gravitational pull. He grew up as a fourth-generation Pentecostal on the Canadian prairies, going from Saskatchewan to Alberta.
Oh, wow. Fourth generation, that is deep.
It is, and his family wasn't clergy, they were working-class business people, which actually reinforces how culturally embedded this theology was.
Hmm.
It wasn't just a Sunday activity for them, it was the lens through which literally all of reality was interpreted.
Right.
By the time he was 17, Trevor had fast-tracked through Bible college and dived straight into vocational ministry as a youth pastor and eventually a church planter. So he is the ultimate insider.
He really is. And the interview brings up a specific phrase regarding that early theology that totally caught my attention. Trevor describes the blueprint he inherited as having fear foundational pieces. He talks about this heavy emphasis on crucifying the flesh, an intense sin consciousness, and constantly monitoring his own behavior.
Well, a fear foundational system is an incredibly effective tool for group cohesion, but it requires exhaustive psychological maintenance.
How so?
Well, if your baseline assumption is that you are inherently flawed, and the authority figure, in this case the divine, is perpetually disappointed or on the verge of judging you, your brain is forced into a state of hypervigilance. You have to constantly monitor your thoughts, police your behavior, ensure your standing within the tribe is secure.
That sounds exhausting.
It is. It creates this underlying chronic hum of anxiety that you are never quite doing enough.
I want to push back on the traditional narrative here, though, because religion, especially in a tight-knit generational community like that, it's almost always pitched as the ultimate source of comfort. Like, it's supposed to be the warm blanket in a cold, chaotic world.
Right.
So if the system is designed to provide answers and comfort, why did Trevor find himself battling this intense angst and wrestling with unanswered theological questions when he was just like 9 or 10 years old?
That is such a good question. The angst is really the natural byproduct of a hypervigilant system meeting a naturally curious mind. When a belief structure demands absolute certainty, but it relies on fear to maintain it, A child's internal logic will eventually spot the structural flaws.
Even at 9 years old.
Exactly. A 9-year-old might not have the vocabulary for cognitive dissonance, but they absolutely feel the anxiety of a system that claims to be about perfect love while operating on a framework of conditional acceptance and fear. The adult answers he was receiving simply acted as, bandages over a foundational crack.
And as he moved into adulthood and full-time ministry, that hypervigilance evolved into what he calls a do-to-be hamster wheel. Which, I mean, I find that phrasing so illustrative.
It's perfect.
It perfectly describes the exhaustion of frantically working overtime at a company you already own just to prove you belong there.
Yeah.
He was exhausting himself trying to basically become someone the theology technically said he already was.
And that level of exhaustion is critical for a paradigm shift. People rarely deconstruct a system that is actively making them happy and relaxed.
Right. If it ain't broke, don't fix it.
Exactly. The sheer fatigue of that do-to-be hamster wheel, it primed him for an alternative. He eventually became involved in a church plant connected to the Catch the Fire ministry, which stemmed from the Toronto Blessing Revival back in the 90s.
Okay, the father's heart stuff.
Right. This introduced a brand new psychological variable for him, the concept of unconditional acceptance and sonship. For the first time, he was exploring a framework where the divine was viewed as a holy, loving father rather than this exacting judge.
Wait, okay, so if he's suddenly introduced to a theology of unconditional acceptance, shouldn't that have just resolved the angst? Like, it sounds like he found the antidote to the fear foundational system right there. Why didn't the paradigm shift stop at that point?
Because introducing a new, comforting concept into an old, fear-based framework doesn't resolve the tension. It actually heightens it. You're basically trying to run a new operating system on outdated hardware.
Oh, that makes so much sense.
Yeah, and the friction of that dissonance leads us to the first major structural collapse in his worldview, which, interestingly enough, had nothing to do with personal acceptance. It had to do with eschatology.
The theology of the end times.
Exactly.
Okay, let's talk about that first domino, because it fell about 25 years ago. Trevor was trained to read apocalyptic literature, specifically the Book of Revelation, as a flat chronological timeline. It was essentially handed to him as this terrifying, literal map of the future.
What's fascinating here is how intellectual curiosity systematically dismantles fear. Trevor applies a very basic logical pressure test to this timeline. He looks at the crucifixion narrative where Jesus famously says, "It is finished."
Right.
And Trevor's brain simply connects two competing ideas. If the work of reconciliation is truly finished, why has humanity tacked on this massive, complex, catastrophic end-time mapping?
Why add all the extra stress?
Why is there a billion-dollar industry built on decoding a horrific future if the primary narrative claims the victory is already secure?
So he investigates, and he discovers there are entirely different, highly optimistic historical interpretations of eschatology. That is a massive psychological domino, because the moment you realize a pillar as massive as the end of the world is actually up for interpretation.
Every other pillar in the building suddenly looks vulnerable.
Okay.
It totally shatters the illusion of absolute certainty. Once you grant yourself permission to question the timeline of the apocalypse, questioning your daily rituals feels significantly less dangerous. And that brings us to the fascinating friction he experienced during his worship services.
Yes, the disconnect. He is internalizing this new union theology, this deep sense that he is completely intertwined with the divine. He feels unconditional love. But then he stands up in a church service embedded in this revival culture, and he actually pays attention to the lyrics they are singing.
And what are they singing?
Well, the vocabulary of the culture is entirely based on separation and desperation. They are singing things like, "I'm desperate for you, I'm lost without you, I'm crying out for the next move."
So he is living in a state of intense cognitive dissonance. His internal reality is experiencing absolute fullness, what he calls feasting on the fullness of God already within him. Yet his external environment demands that he perform the vocabulary of starvation.
The vocabulary of starvation, that is such a good way to put it.
Yet every time he opens his mouth to sing those lyrics, his brain is actively rejecting the words because they completely contradict his lived experience.
I mean, think about it. Have you ever found yourself sitting in a corporate strategy meeting, literally speaking the company's jargon, saying things like, "Let's synergize our core competencies to leverage downstream bandwidth"?
We've all been there.
Right. While your brain is screaming, "This means absolutely nothing, and I fundamentally disagree with our entire business model." You are performing the vocabulary of a culture you no longer belong to just to keep your seat at the table.
That corporate jargon analogy captures the emotional labor perfectly. You are mouthing the words to a script you didn't write, simply because the social cost of breaking character feels way too high. And people can maintain that exhausting balancing act for years.
Oh,
They
absolutely.
sing the songs, they nod in the meetings, and they quietly disagree in the privacy of their own minds.
They maintain it right up until the pressure cooker turns on.
Exactly. Internal friction almost always requires an external catalyst to force a definitive break. And for Trevor, that catalyst was a combination of a toxic environment and a global pandemic.
The timeline laid out in the interview is so compelling. So it's 2019, and Trevor and his wife, Mel, relocate to Alberta. He intends to maintain this itinerant speaking ministry while helping a friend's church leadership team on the side. But then 2020 hits.
The world locks down.
Travel completely vanishes. And because he's grounded, the local church asks him to take over the primary Sunday teaching responsibilities.
And the source material is quite candid about this period. Trevor describes the culture of this specific church leadership as highly dysfunctional and toxic. But, pressure produces diamonds. The absolute misery of navigating that environment forced him to seek an intellectual anchor. He couldn't rely on the toxic culture around him, so he dug aggressively into the original text.
Specifically, the New Testament letters of Paul, like Ephesians, Philippians, and Colossians.
Nice.
Here's where it gets really interesting. Because he's poring over these texts, and he trips over a single preposition that fundamentally alters his reality.
A single word.
Yes. He is reading Galatians, and the account in Acts 9 regarding Paul's conversion. His entire life, the translation he relied on, said that God chose to reveal his son, Tiomi, like a literal spotlight hitting you from the outside.
But a deep dive into the original Greek completely inverted that concept. The preposition wasn't to, it was in. God chose to reveal his son in me. Paul later writes that he preached in the Gentiles, not among them.
But wait, how does one tiny word, like in versus to, trigger a complete paradigm shift? I mean, it seems so small.
It seems small, but it entirely changes your locus of control and authority. If the divine is revealed to you, it remains an external event. It is a memo handed down from a boss. It requires a hierarchy, mediators, institutions, and this constant striving to reach the outside source.
Okay, yeah, I see that.
But if the divine is revealed in you, the locus of authority shifts internally. The separation vanishes. You no longer need an institution to broker your connection to the divine because the reality already exists within your own architecture. It completely bridges that gap between the desperation he was singing about and the union he was actually feeling.
Wow. That shift from external authority to internal reality, it basically broke the dam. Trevor realizes that well into his 50s, he had primarily just consumed the assigned reading from his Bible college.
Right, he was just towing the party line.
Exactly. But armed with this new internal locus of authority, he starts interrogating the absolute bedrock of his theology. Like, where did the concept of original sin actually originate? Who authored the doctrine of eternal conscious torment?
And he discovers these aren't necessarily immutable laws of the universe.
No. They are concepts heavily developed and debated by specific people over centuries.
And the exhilaration of that discovery is so palpable in the interview. He uses this brilliant metaphor, stating that he feels he has just started to sniff the cork of this beautiful new paradigm.
Sniffing the cork, I love that. He hasn't even poured the wine or taken a sip. He is literally just getting the aroma of what it means to think with total freedom, and it is entirely intoxicating to him.
The intoxication of free thought is incredibly powerful. But it brings us to the most dangerous phase of any paradigm shift.
That pushback.
Yeah. Discovering a new, liberating truth in isolation is thrilling. Attempting to share that new truth with a tribe that relies on the old, fear-foundational blueprint for its survival, that is going to trigger a massive autoimmune response from the community.
He sips right into the buzzsaw. Because Trevor is practically vibrating with excitement over this new framework. He has embraced this gospel of total reconciliation, the idea that one died for all, therefore all died in him, and that God isn't counting anyone's sins against them.
It's a very hopeful message.
It is, and he takes this incredibly optimistic message to a pre-scheduled speaking engagement at a camp. He expects them to be just as liberated by this news as he is, but instead it falls entirely flat.
The rejection was immediate, and it was structural. The tribe basically assessed his new theological DNA and determined it was a threat to the host organism. Consequently, The doors to his itinerant preaching ministry just slammed shut. The invitations evaporated overnight.
That is brutal. I mean, imagine discovering a life-changing paradigm that cures your chronic anxiety and makes the whole world make sense. You eagerly call a meeting with your closest peers to hand them the cure, and they not only reject the cure, they lock you out of the building.
Yeah.
It isn't just a loss of income for him, it is the instantaneous evaporation of his identity, his social standing, and his entire community.
It's devastating.
Hmm.
But if we connect this to the bigger picture, the absolute totality of that rejection is precisely what catalyzed his next evolution.
Yes.
Well, the evolutionary biology of tribalism dictates that being cast out of the group basically means death.
Hmm.
It is terrifying. But Trevor and his wife Mel reached a crucial inflection point while driving in their car, just surveying the wreckage of their former life.
Yeah.
They realized that because the tribe had completely stripped them of their standing, they had absolutely zero left to lose.
Oh, wow. The fear of losing his platform was gone because the platform was literally already gone.
Exactly.
Trevor notes, if I keep my mouth shut, I can just sit around waiting for a phone to ring that never will, or I can figure out a new way to share what's actually in my heart. And his family becomes the driving force here. His son points out that nobody can hear his voice unless he actively broadcasts it and pushes him towards social media. And his wife, Mel, completely reinforces it.
Yeah, and Trevor's initial resistance is a classic generational hesitation. He's a guy in his 50s thinking he has absolutely no business making internet content. But someone steps in to help handle the technical bandwidth, and he begins posting short videos, reels online.
And the digital pivot is explosive. He launches a brand called Naturally Supernatural with Trevor Meier. And without the gatekeepers of the physical institutions filtering his message, his unvarnished theology finds this massive, hungry audience almost immediately.
The digital migration bypasses traditional institutional authority entirely. When you are pushed out of the physical room you thought you belonged in, the internet allows you to broadcast a homing beacon to find the people who share your exact intellectual frequency.
Steve Reed shares a hilarious and honestly really poignant anecdote during the interview that proves this perfectly. Steve mentions a local group in his own area that calls themselves Rethinking God with Tacos.
I love that name.
It's great. They are this collection of people who walked away from traditional fear-based churches because they couldn't find anyone teaching a theology based on relational union, so they were desperately trying to cobble together a home study. And someone in their Facebook Messenger chat drops a link to one of Trevor's reels. Right. And Steve sees it and tells the group, guys, I'm literally interviewing that guy this week. And the group just loses its collective mind.
That anecdote perfectly illustrates the ultimate utility of Trevor's journey. His pivot wasn't just about accumulating a new audience to replace the old one. He essentially built a framework to teach other displaced people how to bypass the external noise of institutions and locate their own authentic inner voice.
And Steve asks Trevor the million-dollar question. What advice do you give to the person who is turned off by the institution, who feels the friction, and just wants to know what is actually real?
A very common feeling right now.
Very common. And Trevor's response cuts straight through the theological jargon. He tells people, even those he categorizes as pre-believers, to simply check inward. Ask, Jesus, are you in there? And then pay attention to what your body and your heart tell you.
He provides a highly functional litmus test for truth, which is invaluable when you are swimming in a sea of conflicting ideologies. Trevor asserts that the true inner voice of the divine, or genuine intuition, however you frame it, contains absolutely no angst. It does not induce panic. It is characterized exclusively by peace, love, and joy.
That's a huge distinction.
It is. If you want a visual representation of that divine nature, he advises looking solely at the life of Christ as the expressed image of love, rather than getting entangled in the retributive, angry narratives found in older texts.
Steve Reed actually brings up a deeply personal story that maps perfectly onto this internal filtering system. Steve's sister has been battling multiple sclerosis for a long time. It's a hard, grinding road. And one day, she experiences a strong internal prompt to send Steve the title of a specific book authored by Dr. Sue Morter.
But her immediate reaction is to argue with the prompt, right?
Yes.
She filters the intuition through her anxiety, basically assuming her brother will reject it or misunderstand it.
But the internal push doesn't carry panic. It carries persistence. So she sends the recommendation anyway. Steve orders the book, starts reading, and is just floored. Dr. Sue Morter's work completely aligns with Steve's own paradigm of a relational universe, complete union, and an interconnected source.
Wow.
Sending that book sparked an incredibly deep bonding conversation between Steve and his sister.
And Steve extracts a universal rule from that interaction about how to handle the prompts we feel. He tells his audience, if the intuition you are experiencing is rooted in love, peace, and goodness, trust it completely. Take it to the bank.
But if it's not?
If the internal prompt is driving you toward anger, hate, revenge, or fear, discard it immediately. That is not the signal. That is the noise.
I want to pause right there and turn that lens directly onto you, the listener. Think about the internal dashboard you use to make decisions. How do you distinguish between the voice of your own anxiety, like the voice of your ego, the fear of losing your tribe, the lingering expectations of that blueprint you were handed at birth, and the voice of genuine, quiet intuition?
It is so incredibly easy to confuse the panic squeaking of the hamster wheel with the voice of ultimate truth.
Exactly.
And the confusion is by design. The systems that raise us often train us to conflate fear with authority. We are taught that if a concept makes us afraid of a consequence, it must be the correct rule. Trevor's deconstruction is basically a masterclass in untangling authority from fear. He realized that the truest reality inside him didn't make him hypervigilant. It grounded him in profound peace.
So what does this all mean? Look at the psychological arc we just traced. We analyzed a man exhausted by the constant maintenance of a fear foundational blueprint.
Yeah, that hamster wheel.
We watched intellectual curiosity push over a single domino regarding end times theology, which then exposed the cognitive dissonance of singing songs of desperation while experiencing internal union.
And we saw how the external pressure cooker of a toxic environment drove him to investigate the original blueprints for himself. That led to the realization that a single preposition in versus to could shift the locus of authority from external institutions right back to internal reality.
We examined the severe sociological cost of authenticity when his tribe rejected him, and how losing everything gave him the freedom to broadcast his true frequency, ultimately finding a community built on peace rather than panic.
Exactly.
As we established at the start, you really don't need to be analyzing ancient Greek texts to apply this. If you are reevaluating the trajectory of your career, or feeling the friction of a political ideology that no longer fits, or trying to understand why a relationship feels structurally unsound, the mechanism is exactly the same.
The human psychology doesn't change.
It doesn't. Having the courage to stop blindly accepting the assigned reading and start thinking for yourself is a universal necessity. It requires the bravery to admit that the words you are required to sing no longer match the reality you are actually living.
It forces a confrontation with our own legacy. We are all handed a heavily annotated blueprint when we arrive, but survival requires us to eventually transition from being the occupants of someone else's building to becoming the architects of our own minds. You have to decide which load-bearing walls are actually just drywall and, knock them down so you can finally breathe.
I want to leave you with a final, lingering thought to mull over today. Visualize that thick, highlighted rulebook you were handed by your culture or your family or your industry. If you methodically stripped away every single rule, every doctrine, and every external expectation that has been placed on you since childhood, what would the unfiltered sound of your own internal voice actually be? And the much harder question, would you be brave enough to follow it if it led you to walk completely out of the house you spent your entire life building?